Okay, our last presenter of the session is Dr. Norman Vorano. He is a national scholar in Indigenous visual and material culture of the Americas at Queen's University, where he is an assistant professor in art history and is cross-appointed to the Agnes Etherington Arts Center. Before joining the university in 2014, Dr. Vorano was the curator of contemporary Inuit art and the curator of Indigenous art at the Canadian Museum of History, formerly the Canadian Museum of Civilization. A graduate of the program in Visual and Cultural Studies at the University of Rochester in New York, Dr. Vorano has researched and published on the local dynamics of Inuit art in a world system, while working with emerging and senior contemporary artists in Cape Dorset, Iqaluit, Parnattung, and in urban centers in southern Canada. His 2011 exhibition and catalog, Inuit Prints, Japanese Inspiration, Early Printmaking in the Canadian Arctic, examined the historical linkage between Japanese printmaking and the birth of Inuit printmaking in the late 1950s. He is now working on mid-20th century graphic arts from the North Bathurst region, and he is also editing a volume on mentors and middlemen in Duke University Press's upcoming Multiple Modernism series. Welcome.
Thank you for the introduction, Sarah, and also thank you for acknowledging territory. And thank you to the organizers for doing such a wonderful job. So let me begin. I have something of a more reflective presentation here today, but I really want to do two rather contradictory things in my presentation. And on the one hand, I want to offer a justification for and propose an example of an expanded field of portraiture, and we've seen instantiations of this already, that would be amenable to the diverse artistic traditions that Indigenous people have to represent identities, from early colonial into the modern periods. So the first part begins in 2005, when I was invited by Professor Ruth Phillips. I think we've all mentioned her in our talks. Shame she's not here. At Carleton University to assist her in the development of the Aboriginal components of portraiture for the Portrait Gallery of Canada, then a new national museum entering advanced stages of design in 2005. Professor Phillips was a guest curator contracted by the gallery to work with its senior administrative and curatorial team to come up with a dedicated Aboriginal component that would be part of the gallery's long-term installation, as well as to develop a broader curatorial approach that would guide the gallery's representation of the Indigenous presence in Canadian history through portraiture. Based on my experiences at the Portrait Gallery and the curatorial approach we developed there, I've come to think through some questions about Indigenous visual culture, art, and the potentials of self-portraiture in a greatly expanded context in ways that I'll spell out in further detail. But on the other hand, the second and shorter part of my presentations offers a more cautionary note in this effort to enlarge our ideas of portraiture, that is to say, to encompass Indigenous artistic traditions by asking, to what degree and to what end can the concept of self-portraiture, or portraiture at all, be used in the latter case? And to explore this, I actually turned to the example of Kenojuak, the preeminent Inuit graphic artist of the 20th century, as something of an alternate case study and a counterpoint of a sort. The case of Kenojuak allows me to flesh out, in a different but I think complementary way, the way by which power, agency, gender, and the marketing of Indigenous arts had become entangled with predominantly settler notions of self-portraiture and personhood in the mid-20th century, and the implications that this can have for curating historical collections. And if I may say, I offer the following example really as a starting point to a discussion and a way to air my own ambivalence rather than offering any fixed answers here. So let me begin at the Portrait Gallery. The fraught history of the Portrait Gallery after the election of Stephen Harper's Conservative government in 2006 is likely well known to most of you. That part of the institution's history is beyond the scope of my talk today, but a bit of background is certainly necessary to help set the stage. The official announcement of a new national museum, the Portrait Gallery of Canada, came in 2001 under the Liberal government of Jean Chrétien, beginning its life as a branch within the Library and Archives Canada, from which it drew the bulk of its material for exhibition. The new portrait gallery was to be situated across from the lawns of the Centre Block Peace Tower in the vacated American Embassy building, an early 20th century Beaux-Arts heritage building that stands at the corner of one of the busiest tourist intersections in downtown Ottawa, which you see right here. Under the stewardship of Lily Colton, appointed acting director of the gallery in 2001, this is what we never got in the end, unfortunately. The gallery, then an institutional reality, but not yet a brick and mortar reality, envisioned and planned for a major addition to the historic embassy building, which was then now owned by the Canadian government, a vibrant online presence, traveling exhibitions, and a myriad of other educational programs to help contextualize and share Canada's portrait collections, which were previously squirreled away in library and archives vaults and frankly largely invisible to most of the public. And if I may add, parenthetically, for those of you who may not be familiar with this saga, the portrait gallery was purposefully stalled by the Conservative government after their election to power in 2006, and then effectively canceled by the same government in 2009 due to partisan wrangling. And that lovely Beaux-Arts building at 100 Wellington Street, situated in a prime ceremonial location directly facing the Parliament buildings, remains empty today. The overall curatorial approach of the gallery, developed by head curator Joanna Misgala, was a dynamic, multivocal, and inclusive narrative of Canadian history that highlighted English and French settler history alongside Indigenous histories, histories of the marginalized, and the histories of culturally diverse immigrant groups in Canada. Alongside studio portraits of well-heeled members of society would be informal sketches, ephemera, mementos, photographs, commissions of new artworks in a variety of visual and time-based media, with the intent of redressing the systemic gaps, social exclusions, and cultural omissions inherent to a genre of representation that was inexorably tied to a Western European bourgeois class, and which scarcely did justice to Canada's multicultural reality and, of course, Aboriginal presence, and, of course, overwhelmingly privileged experiences of Aboriginal men due to the systemic collecting biases. While such inclusions were invariably framed within the dominant settler narrative of nation and nation building, the juxtaposition of different genres and modes of representation created visual dialogues throughout the gallery that offered temporary but meaningful interventions into the dominant narratives of social harmony and nation building that was to be expected in a national museum. Ruth Phillips wrote a marvelous chapter on this in her 2011 book, Museum Pieces, called From Harmony to Antiphony, which describes this unrealized project in far greater detail than I could do here. But in terms of a new post-colonial museology that opens a space to, quote, disrupt classical structures of display, to express not just historical convergences and contemporary commonalities, but also past divergences and contemporary differences, unquote, through portraiture. As guest curators, we felt we had a unique opportunity and responsibility to continue this project of enlarging the idea of portraiture and draw attention to past and contemporary divergences rather than convergences. We invited about 20 Aboriginal consultants from across Canada, experts in historical and cultural matters, to discuss with us the nature of the project, establish a broad direction, and provide specific feedback. Additionally, we engaged Indigenous cultural organizations and advisory bodies in different parts of Canada, notably with Haudenosaunee consultants in Six Nations and Clecho elders in Ray-Edzo, Northwest Territories, whom you see here, for more in-depth discussions relating to our possible inclusions of portraits, however broadly conceived, of historically prominent people from their communities who were to be featured in the gallery. The resulting discussions immediately drew our attention to the need to imagine a definition of portraiture that could include Aboriginal traditions that are both materially and cognitively different, and in some ways incommensurably so, from Western traditions of portraiture. And our investigations through modern collections again underscored the gender imbalances of collections themselves. One of the central challenges was in attempting to communicate to audiences in the gallery that Indigenous portrait traditions are not simple analogues to European traditions, but frequently involve fundamentally different concepts of personhood and subjectivity than do settler concepts of portraiture. These concepts rarely adhere to the visual mimetic traditions of a settler culture, and in many of our examples, such as found in the signatures of the 40 chiefs who signed the Great Peace of Montreal Treaty in 1701, the Aboriginal visual traditions of self-representation involved the use of non-human referential symbols, frequently in the form of an animal or other non-referential symbols that evoked a person's clan, their inherited relationships that encompassed a network of living and deceased beings, all of which placed an individual within a horizontal and vertical lattice work of human to human and human to non-human relationships. Additionally, we became aware through our discussions that the privileging itself of the visual inherent to the European portrait tradition would likely exclude many historical expressions of Indigenous identities, which did not operate primarily or exclusively through the visual at all, but encompassed songs, stories, and names. I show you here a drawing by an Inuit artist, Kenojuak, from the early 1950s, which attempts to translate this rhythmic beating of a drum into a static but repeating image of a drum, each representing a pulse over which his songs, which reveal his identity, would resonate. And much to their credit, the portrait gallery staff welcomed the approach that we developed with the close collaboration and support of our many consultants, which would include audio tracks, spoken language, dress, and garments. With this in mind, the overall approach we sought was to bring both European and Indigenous modes of representation together in the first section of the gallery, which we provisionally called Facing the Other. The room was to include a series of 5 clusters comprised of both Indigenous and settler visual expressions, songs, texts, to demonstrate the existence of complex traditions of representing the self in Indigenous societies prior to the arrival of Europeans, to show these systems as being different from settler traditions, and to show how these ways of self-presentation were implicated in the historical alliances, networks of trade, conflicts, and mutual misunderstandings that existed between Indigenous and settlers during the colonial period. I want to illustrate our approach with just one example of a visual cluster that we recommended for inclusion. To represent historical encounters in the Great Lakes region, we recommended the Jesuit missionary Louis Nicolas' 17th century Codex Canadensis from 1675 to 80, and a mid-17th century war club from the Eastern Woodlands. You see them both together here, paired. These two pieces, both of which would face each other to suggest alternate ways of representing self and other, would be situated near a suite of 4 paintings by the London-based Dutch artist Jan Verelst, depicting the 3 Mohawk and 1 Mohican representatives that made a diplomatic visit to London in 1710, known as the so-called Four Indian Kings suite. And I focus on the war clubs and the codex here. Created by the Jesuit missionary Louis Nicolas, the Codex Canadensis was the first major compilation of visual images of the Aboriginal peoples, plants, and animals of New France based on Nicolas' first-hand experiences while in North America. The individual images contain rich information not only about the things that Europeans found remarkable, strange, or new, but about Aboriginal technologies, fashions in dress, and ways of presenting individual and collective identities. It records, for example, the clothing, ornaments, body paintings, and tattoo designs that signify the role and status of an individual and the blessing of power acquired through encounters with spirit beings, and in the following case, an individual bearing a Turtle Clan tattoo on the man's body. The 17th century European tendency to record images of humans together with those of flora and fauna would become associated with the European conceptualization of Aboriginal people as children of nature in the 18th century, and with evolutionist cultural hierarchies at the end of the 19th. However, the panoply of imagery in the Codex also resonates with Aboriginal cosmologies, which link the powers of humans, animals, and other kinds of beings into reciprocal relationships. The War Club from the Eastern Woodlands has a more obscure provenance, although it dates between 1620 and 1680, and was likely created by a Haudenosaunee or Iroquois warrior to cement relations with the British military, as the club is associated with Lieutenant John King of Massachusetts. A close-up of the club reveals an extraordinary vignette rendered in inlaid brass that captures the facial tattoos and side-cropped hair that would have been part of this man's initiation into a warrior society, and as such reveals his rank and status within Haudenosaunee society. Additionally, the club includes small details such as an inverted thunderbird, which you can't quite see but is on the chest, another possible tattoo, and what appears to be a turtle, which could represent the clan of the Senecas, as we see in the later Great Peace of Montreal Treaty, which was signed by 30 chiefs around the Great Lakes in 1701. You see the same symbols of clan there. While the face itself on the War Club, and to some degree the faces in Nicola's Codex as well, lack the mimetic qualities that can be found in Jan Verhelst's more conventional full-length portraits, which were painted in the artist's London studio some years later, we can find an overlap of some symbols, notably in the tattoos and clan symbols. As other scholars have pointed out, the rather amateurish depiction of North American animals in the corner of Verhelst's portrait suggests that, unlike the paintings of the people here, the animals were painted from description alone, likely at the insistence of the sitters, who saw these animals not as accoutrements, decorations, or their personal property, but as an intrinsic part of their identity and personhood, in this case, the bear. Now, to return to the question I began with, so what are the limits of extending concepts of portraiture to Indigenous contexts? On the one hand, we fight against the gendered preferences of museum collections and the denigration of women's works and the overwhelming fact that many men did a lot of early museum collecting. Does enlarging settler concepts of portraiture unintentionally reinscribe Western modes of personhood and modern subjectivities into historical and cultural contexts where they really have no business belonging? Is the price of admission to this artistic genre of portraiture or self-portraiture such that we conspire to individuate and remake historical actors into our own likeness as modern viewing subjects? I raise these questions in light of Loretta Todd's argument that Indigenous artists should, quote, escape epistemological dependency, unquote, on colonial genres and temporalities of the mainstream art world, but also with the awareness that the Western genres have historically provided the conceptual and institutional categories that have enabled non-Western arts to migrate into museums and galleries, and of course through collectors and dealers. So my counterpoint here is drawn from a much different context, one with a closer historical proximity to us, and of course not part of the Portrait Gallery of Canada experiences. Kenojuak Ashevak was the preeminent Inuit graphic artist of the 20th century. Extraordinary life. Born in an igloo in 1927 outside of South Baffin Island community of Cape Dorset, she died in 2013 as one of the most recognizable Canadian artists, Indigenous or otherwise, I would say. The work that catapulted her to national and international attention, a version of which you see in the exhibition, and partly one of the reasons why I chose her as an example, was the print The Enchanted Owl, executed in 1960. Apart from some stylistic detours in the 1980s and 90s, she has remained remarkably faithful to this kind of style, this iconic and bold graphic style, and including similar thematic content over much of her career, in which she has contributed more than 300 prints for the Cape Dorset studio, and many of which, of course, depict Arctic birds and owls in particular. But the idea that the Enchanted Owl came to represent a self-portrait of Kenojuak arose not in the 1960s, as one might have expected, especially after the flood of attention that she received after the release of the NFB's film Eskimo Artist Kenojuak in 1963, followed by her appointment to the Order of Canada in 1967, and the reproduction of The Enchanted Owl on a commemorative Canadian stamp in 1970, but it took hold almost 2 decades later, after the work's creation. and based upon rather elliptical statements that she made to Jean Blodgett during an interview in the 1970s. The idea then was subsequently taken up by other authors and repeated in a variety of publications on Canadian art and Inuit art. Kenojuak was a sometimes elusive and contradictory interviewee, and Blodgett ultimately surmised from these interviews that, quote, "For Kenojuak, her subjects have no deep meaning. Most of her subjects are a bird, a person, rather than a particular being, place, event, or time," unquote. A sentiment that Kenojuak herself has repeated on a number of occasions. And yet the art world's investment in a vision of Kenojuak Ashevak as an artist engaging in Euro-American formats, including portraiture, says much about the way it consolidates artistic reputations and produces subjects in its own image. I chose the word investment intentionally here. In just 20 years, this print, which originally sold at galleries for $25 in 1960, was fetching $15,000 at auction in 1980, a number that trebled by the early 2000s as auction sales of the Enchanted Owl prints broke the $50,000 mark. We might call this, with apologies to Simon Watney, the Kenojuak effect, a system of cultural representation that seeks to shore up Western models of artistic value, originality, autonomy of art, and the subjectivity just as those models are critically interrogated by critical scholars across the humanities and new artistic practices. Whether Kenojuak's Enchanted Owl or not is a self-portrait is in some ways besides the point here. There are certainly clues that suggest this was in fact the case. The larger point here is our awareness of this entangled history of art writing, spectatorship, and commoditization, or in the case of the Portrait Gallery of Canada, the making of national subjects, that may conspire to re-entrench Western genres and genders, and with it, Western notions of subjectivity and personhood. Kenojuak is an interesting counterpart because, unlike most of the colonial era Indigenous artists we've looked at, Kenojuak did have a voice, albeit one mediated through galleries, curators, interpreters, dealers, and scholars like me. And yet, even her voice has limits, or I should say, we can actually stop hearing at some point in time. In interviews with Sandra Bars in 1973 and again with Terry Ryan in 1977, Kenojuak attributed a few of her key early prints to her husband, Johnny Bow, who suffered an untimely death in 1972. Woman Who Lives in the Sun is one of those prints. The Enchanted Owl, like The Enchanted Owl, it was published in 1960, and it shares many stylistic hallmarks with its radial symmetry, finger-like feathers, and direct stare that engages the viewer quite dead on. It was initially attributed to Kenojuak in the 1960 Cape Dorset print catalog and circulated as such for more than a decade, in spite of Kenojuak's repeated clarifications in 1973 and 1977 that the work was the creation of her husband, Johnny. And in spite of this, Johnny Bow's name continues to be minimized or removed from the historical record. The National Gallery of Canada's website takes a cautious approach to the subject by simply adding a question mark after Kenojuak's name, but does not include Johnny Bow's name. And I show you a 2011 auction from Heffel's Auction House, which makes no mention of Johnny Bow at all, and the question mark is absolutely gone. So to end with a final question then, we can stretch this concept of portraiture and self-portraiture to include Indigenous expressions of self and identity. But this new frame that we've created, is it a window into other ways of being? Is it a window into another? Or is it simply a mirror reflecting back our own image? Thank you very much.